more cartoons to take a look at. You know how I love cartoons. Okay, I feel like cartoons are so powerful, and instead of reading text, right, really captures what people are thinking or feeling. So if you look at document A on the left, right, you have President Wilson sort of blowing bubbles, or these sort of highfalutin, fancy idealism, right? In a perfect world, we would all get along, we would all hold hands, and there would be no winners, no losers, right? We would just come together for peace, right? So it's definitely a sarcastic, right? Wilson creating this. The other cartoon on the right is also interesting because you can see Wilson kind of reaching out to a figure that looks like Uncle Sam. And this is all something to take note of. So when we start actually getting into the treaty, President Wilson again has these ideas, and we'll look at in a moment, that don't play out. But the thing of it is that's significant is when he actually finally comes back to the United States, right, to get the treaty ratified. Now, ratification means basically approval. Because if we go back to our U.S. history books or U.S. Constitution studies, even though people think that the president can do whatever he can or do whatever he needs to, technically, according to our legal document, the U.S. Constitution, treaties that are signed with foreign governments, they must be ratified through Congress. So when President Wilson comes back, a lot of Americans feel like they do not want to sign this treaty because this could potentially pull them back into a European conflict. Right? We touched on this briefly, and I know in U.S. history you'll dig into it a little bit further. United States had not been tied for the most part. It was involved in isolation. There was two events that pulled it into play, which includes the Lusitania sinking and also the Zimmermann telegram. So the Zimmermann note or telegram, right, was the secret alliance that Germany was trying to forge with Mexico in hopes that, again, it would prevent America from getting the jump start and supporting the Allies. So you can see right there, America does not want to get into the sinking ship, so to speak. So important to note, again, what Wilson dreams of, the blowing bubbles, does not play out in his version of the Treaty of Versailles. All right, spending some time to look at President Wilson, let's take a look at one of our other members of the Big Four, which is George Clemenceau, known as the Tiger. Now, he was called the Tiger because he had that very combative style, right? Very aggressive in personality. And he represented France's position from the treaty. Now, let's bear in mind, let's flash back here, right? Most of our discussion of the Western Front had been in northern France. So when we talk about the destruction, the casualties, the trenches literally had to be filled, bodies had to be removed, right? France is completely devastated. Think about, again, France's perspective, right? They're looking basically for someone to pay, someone to blame in this case. And then if we're being honest, right, some revenge. So France comes in with the position, number one, we're trying to get rid of the German military. They're the ones that were so aggressive and really sort of, developed, right? They were the ones that invaded neutral Belgium and really steered that establishment of the Western Front. France's position is also coming in, looking for security. They want to make sure that Germany is not able to rise or, fight back, right? It's a preventive action. We don't want their military to come back and, hit us again. And then also France is looking for some financial support. So through our course of our discussion of the Treaty of Versailles, when we use the word financial, we use the word reparations. And reparations are basically the money that Germany is going to have to repay. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, well, gee, didn't everybody have a role to play with the alliances and everybody sort of jumping in to support their friendship? But for several reasons, right, Germany is the one that jumps in. Germany was the most aggressive. Germany. So everybody really looks to point the finger at Germany. Okay. When we look at Great Britain's position on David Lloyd George, publicly he wants Germany punished. They're also looking to making sure that Germany's navy is significantly cut. Germany had a very strong navy, and that has to do with, again, our discussion of imperialism, right? Speaking of imperialism, they were also looking as a way to pay back the financial loss. They were looking to take over German colonies, which, again, is significant, right? Colonies were a huge source of income, resources, trade. We looked at all those reasons in our discussion of imperialism. So put yourself again in Germany's position. The loss of the colonies is going to prove huge. Now, privately, one thing to note, right? David Lloyd George was kind of in the middle because he did support Clemenceau's position, but he also kind of, spoke privately that he was very concerned about crippling Germany in this way. And then he was also very concerned about, I said on the screen, the spread of communism. So as we see the transition, right, from going from the end of the Tsar regime to Lenin to Trotsky, when we start moving into Joseph Stalin, there was a fear that this regime change would spread across Europe, and there was a thought if Germany was punished too severely, that could be a situation to come into play. Okay. The other one I'll just make a brief note on is Vittorio Orlando, his perspective, right? Now, Italy originally had joined the Triple Alliance. However, it did sort of switch teams, and they do fight on the side of the Allies. And one of the reasons why is because they were promised territory at the close of the war, which is territory along the Adriatic coast. So Orlando comes into the treaty looking to secure that peace that he thought Italy was noted or deserved. And then most people kind of blow it off. Don't feel it like it's a major consideration. And that's important to note because when Orlando returns to Italy, Italy's almost embarrassed. They weren't able to secure the spoils of victory. And it's really going to be something that when we start talking about the rise of dictators, Benito Mussolini, he's going to play into that sort of embarrassment and that fear that Italians have over that loss of territory. All right, so all those positions in play, we finally get to a point that the treaty is developed. Now, again, Germany doesn't have a voice in this. We know Wilson was trying to push peace, but he gets denied. Nobody wants to be hearing about peaceful negotiations, right? People want revenge, they want money, they want payback, right? They want to put their nation in a position of strength after they've been crippled so severely. Now, also important to note before I move on, I also want to connect that by 1919, or at the close of World War I, we have Germany, which is going to end the Kaiser, right, which was in charge previously, and we see that Germany is going to transition to a republic. So the republic is known as the Weimar Republic, which we know republic connects us back to democracy. So when the Weimar Republic sort of takes power, it is a new government. It's weak, right, for various reasons, and it's put in a position where ultimately they were forced to sign this document. So Germany will sign the Treaty of Versailles, and I want to leave us with the last few themes of what the treaty specifically is going to do to Germany, which we're going to take a closer look at in our DBQ documents. The first one that we could argue is probably the most severe, which is something we call blame. Okay, Germany was forced in the Treaty of Versailles to basically sign a piece or article of the treaty which was nicknamed the War Guilt Clause. So in the treaty basically said Germany started all, it was all your fault, you were the most aggressive, and you can imagine on the screen it says it was the most hated part of the treaty. Because if you were paying attention at all, you know for a fact this was not a situation in which Germany was completely to blame, right? Go back to the Spark, go back to the alliances, go back to the Balkan Peninsula, right? So this is something, as we look in the documents, is going to be very aggressive, very irritating, very resented by the German people. The second one, which is huge, is we see reparations. So reparations. Germany is going to be saddled with billions of dollars of basically financial debt that it must pay back to the Allied powers. So you can imagine, we mentioned before, the war cost a lot of money for everybody involved. So everybody's struggling to get out of debt and kind of rebuild their country. So Germany is faced with that same challenge, but you add on top of that, then now they have to pay back again this debt. Okay, so reparations is going to be huge when we start looking at why Germany is struggling with the Treaty of Versailles. All right, we also look at the Treaty of Versailles for its army cuts. Now, giving a little more backstory, Germany, one of the things that Germany sort of took pride in, that nationalism we talked about, the strength, the unification. Most of the German people were extremely proud of their military force. We had hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They had developed their empire, their Reich as they call it. They had a huge navy. They had submarines. They had early airplanes that we said were starting to be introduced, right, in World War I. So at the close of the Treaty of Versailles, basically now Germany's capped. It's only allowed to have so many soldiers. It's only allowed to have a half dozen or so warships, no planes, and no submarines. Okay, so one side of the coin is, yes, your military is strong, you did a lot of damage, so we're cutting it down. The second type of the coin, right, is to also think about, Germany's realizing it has a lot of enemies in the world. And when you take away a country's ability to defend themselves, that can sometimes make them feel attacked or threatened, right? And similar to an animal, right? If you back an animal in a corner or if you threaten so long, that anxiety is going to build up. And eventually, right, we could see retaliation. We could see them standing up for themselves. So it's important to know when you put a country in a position of weakness, there can be effects, which we're going to take a look at. The last one I want to look at for today is the last piece, which was proof significant, which you can imagine. So for a country, according to, if I can fix that, according to the Treaty of Versailles, we're going to see that territory is taken away from Germany. Now, a few little chunks, specifically Alsace-Lorraine, right, is taken back. This particular area of the map is given back to France. Okay, this orange portion on the map is known as the Rhineland, which is the land next to the Rhine River. Makes sense. This particular area of the map is going to be an area that is called, it's demilitarized. So demilitarized meaning there's no soldiers or no military bases allowed. And the perspective of France, right, it creates that sort of that buffer zone. If Germany marched through Belgium, right, and tried to attack along the Western Front, this prevents them from sort of getting too close and kind of breathing down their necks. Also, again, Germany lost areas up to the north, Prussia, which gives them access to ports, which is significant. Germany lost their colonies. Germany lost a lot of land that had natural resources in it. So land is about resources, resources for the people, resources for a country to rebuild after such a destructive war. So Germany is struggling. Now, trick to remember is if you go back to the slides, I'm all about tricks, remember? Sometimes in history there's a lot to remember, but here's a little trick I want to give you to remember the Treaty of Versailles. I want you to remember B-R-A-T, which is brat. So brat will be the Treaty of Versailles, the four main provisions that really are going to cripple Germany, and we're going to explore further in the DBQ documents. One more slide I forgot to mention that I definitely want to include this in the lecture. So the Western powers signed the separate peace treaties in 1919 and 1920 with each of the other defeated nations, right? Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. So even though most of our focus is on Germany in this case, those treaties with those countries also led to huge land losses for the Central Powers. So if you look at the map on the screen, right, several new countries were created out of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So we have Austria now, we have Hungary, we have Czechoslovakia, we have Yugoslavia. So all of those are recognized as independent nations. The Ottoman Turks were forced to give up almost all of their former empire, and they retained only a territory that's pretty much today their country, which is Turkey. The Allies carved up the lands that the Ottomans sought, that they lost in Southwest Asia, Palestine, Iraq, British colonies under control of Syria, Lebanon, and all those were sent to France. So Russia, which had left the war early, suffered land losses as well. Romania and Poland both gained Russian territory. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, formerly part of Russia, now became independent nations.